I remember when the Howard the Duck film came out, we thought, oh, at least we finally got a real producer on board. It was a George Lucas
Yeah.
production. So, we were kind of hoping it would be on something a little more high profile than Howard the Duck. But so they had a screening for the whole Marvel office, and we go into the theater, and when the movie was over and the lights came up, no one knew whether we were supposed to clap or not, because we were just sitting there kind of stunned that, what was that?
Welcome to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I'm joined by Carl Potts, a legendary Marvel Comics writer, artist, and editor from, especially from the 80s to the 90s. Hello there, Mr. Potts. How are you doing?
Hello, nice to be here.
My first question I ask everyone is, why comics? What was the spark for you? Who did it? What did it? What book?
When I grew up, I liked any form of visual storytelling, particularly sequential visual storytelling, whether it was Saturday morning cartoons or comics or film, TV. When I was growing up, I would often get up early Saturday mornings and mow the lawn and take the money my dad gave me down to the local variety store and turn the spinner racks around and figure out what I was going to spend my money on, grab at least one comic and a candy bar, and go back and read and reread the comic over again. There was something about comics. And then at some point I discovered Marvel's early on, when the creation of the Marvel Universe. I think I was like a year and a half behind the actual start. And then Steve Ditko's work in particular on Spider-Man and Doctor Strange really grabbed me. And he was my first big artistic influence. I got to meet him years later a couple times. So somewhere after high school, when I went into college initially, I was debating whether or not to go into commercial art or music or marine biology.
Oh, wow.
So my career could have gone in a variety of different ways. I've always been into aquatic biology and ichthyology. But I ended up going into commercial art, and then I decided, I was born and raised for the most part in the California Bay Area, East Bay, San Francisco, East Bay. And I'd never really moved away from home. Even when I went to college, it was nearby. So I just stayed at home. But I very naively decided to pick up and move across the country to New York to try and break into comics. And through a combination of hard work, dumb luck, and some really nice people, I managed to break in and make a career out of doing something I enjoyed, when a lot of other people who similarly wanted to break in and went to New York weren't able to do so. And a lot of it just has to do with dumb luck falling my way, but a lot of it also had to do with me encountering the right people at the right time, just by luck.
Steve Ditko, that's interesting, an answer, because I think if we asked to most people who were reading comics back then, they would answer the other Marvel Age comics artist in terms of being.
Yeah, well, I always loved Kirby. My first exposure to Marvel actually was Jack Kirby. It was in I went to the PX with my father, and they had comics there, and I saw the first issue of Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, which was my first exposure to Kirby. And in there was where I saw the house ads for the other Marvel titles like Spider-Man and the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. But that Sergeant Fury was just so weird and wonky. And I thought, I don't really care for this guy's actual drawing style. And I'd put it away. But every day I'd find myself digging it out of the drawer and going over it again. It wasn't until I was older I realized that it was his dynamics and his visual storytelling that hooked me. I didn't actually care for his rendering style, but his dynamics and his storytelling were just top notch. And so I appreciated it on that level. But when it came to storytelling and actual drawing style, Ditko was the one that had the biggest
Yeah.
influence on me.
When it comes to comics, you've been a writer, you've been an artist, and you've been an editor. Do you have a particular role that you favor?
No, I liked them all, and that's one of the reasons I liked being on staff at Marvel for most of the time I was there, because I could be an editor full time, and then whatever time I had left for freelance work, I could freelance draw or write for them. The caveat there being is whatever, if you were on staff at Marvel and you did freelance work for them as well, you couldn't edit yourself, which I think in general was a very good policy. So like I couldn't assign myself to draw or write a book in the pool of books I was editing. And that also meant that any creative work I did had to have an independent editor judging the work as opposed to me editing myself. We're all blind to our own weaknesses. So, you're not very good at editing yourself because you're blind to your own weaknesses. So, for instance, when I was writing and doing layouts on Punisher War Journal, the editor it was assigned to didn't give me any feedback at all. It was just kind of an empty chair there for me. And a lot of creators would have loved that because they can do whatever they want. I wanted strong story editing feedback. So even though he didn't get credit for it, the early issues of War Journal, the story editor on it was Ralph Macchio. I asked him as a favor to read my plots and give me feedback on it. So he was the uncredited story editor on those early War Journals.
That's interesting. These uncredited stories, I've been finding them really fascinating. What is the secret to putting together a comic book? Let's say you're the editor and you're putting together the writer, the artist. What's the secret to putting it together?
Well, back then, being an editor is a little different than it is now. Back then, editors had a lot more authority and power over their books than today. Today, there's like so many layers of executives on top of you that are making decisions about long-term storylines for publishing plans that are tied into different media incarnations of the intellectual properties. And when I was editing, if you were assigned a title to edit, you were responsible for hiring the creative crew, the penciler, the inker, the writer, the letterer, colorist. And your job was to oversee them. And also back then, almost all of the books we did were done what was called Marvel style. Mm-hmm. Whereas at DC, it started out with the writer writing a full script where each page was broken down panel by panel. It described each panel. It showed you exactly all the dialogue and all the captions. In Marvel style, the writers initially wrote a plot that didn't break things down page by page. And that allowed the artists to pace the story the way they saw fit, to add and subtract or emphasize or de-emphasize things. And then when the pencils were done, they went back to the writer who, based on the pencils, would write the finished dialogue and captions. And if you're doing your job right as an editor, you were pairing up the right two people to fulfill those things. If one of them wasn't up to the task, it could be a disaster. Or if they didn't work well together for one reason or another, personalities or whatever. So your job was to put together the right teams to work in that way. And I was fortunate, and most of the times, most of the pair-ups between creators that I did, they worked out pretty well. It was, I don't know, it was a fun job, even though there were times when, things go wrong and you're banging your head against the wall. Generally speaking, it was the best job I've ever had. And I got to be able to be creative at the same time. I'd often come in early in the mornings, and before the phone started ringing or the meetings started happening, I would do sketches for the covers for my books that were on schedule for that week. And I would often do these quick sketches and be able to assign them to amazing artists that would turn these, very rough things into amazing pieces of work. Kevin Nolan would take something I gave him that was barely legible and turn it into a masterpiece, or Bill Sienkiewicz, or, you know, somebody along those lines, Brett Blevins. So that was also a lot of fun. The other thing that was really good up there was that sometimes the editors and the creators would get together and brainstorm stories for different projects, or like sometimes if we needed a fill-in issue or an annual story, we'd just get together in a room. And if you get the right, 2, 3, 4 people in a room that have the right attitude and they're all enthusiastic about what they're doing and they're brainstorming, that's just a huge joy, because everybody's bouncing off everybody else's ideas, that's evolving, and usually you end up with something great coming out of it.
Would an artist, let's say, would an average artist that you pick out of the talent pool, how do I word this? Would an artist that you just generally pick out of the talent pool, and you assign them to any book, would they reach a certain level of success on that book, guaranteed? Or is it important to properly, quote unquote, cast an artist into a correct book?
I think you want to make sure that you assign someone to something that they have an interest in, a genre or subject matter that they're interested in. They'll do their best work for it. Even if you're a pro and you approach something that I'm going to do my best work, put my best foot forward, no matter what it is, if it's something that you really are interested in, you can't help but put a little extra oomph into the work. So I think that's important. But yeah, if someone like, if they don't like, for instance, here's an example. Mike Mignola, when I first started editing, was primarily an inker.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he penciled one story in Marvel Fanfare, but generally he was an inker. And on the back of the pages he'd send in when he was done inking were all these amazing sketches of creatures and monsters and things. And I would look at them, and Bill Mantlo, who was a writer I was working with, would look at them. And Bill proposed a Rocket Raccoon miniseries, and we both thought Mike would be perfect to pencil it. And so that was Mike's first series that he penciled, was Rocket Raccoon, which at the time everybody thought we were nuts for doing. They couldn't imagine that would ever be popular. It took 30 years to be vindicated for that. But then Mike, at that time, that was a book filled with creatures. Mike at the time wasn't really confident in drawing normal humans or even superheroes at that time. And I needed a new artist on the Hulk. So the Hulk's a pretty monstrous character. So that's where he went next. Mm. And then eventually he worked up into Alpha Flight and got into, drawing more human or human related characters along those lines. So sometimes you do have to cater a bit to people's strengths and weaknesses, but at the same time, I like to try and encourage them to become more versatile if they can. The more versatile you are as a comics artist, the better and longer your career is liable to be, if you just specialize in one thing.
Just telling that entire story, I can already see how Mike eventually evolved into being able to do Hellboy. So what is let's put it this way, like, how do you put talent in that kind of position to succeed? For example, Punisher War Journal, you actually drew the first 3 issues and you were inked over by some guy named Jim Lee. But then by the 4th issue, Jim Lee was already penciling. And was that a conscious decision on your part?
Well, with War Journal, I was never like a very fast artist, so I never really took on a monthly title. And when I was editing, I had even less time, but I really wanted to do the writing and at least the layouts for the War Journal issues. So I talked the editor-in-chief and the sales and marketing people into putting it on a 6-week schedule, not a 4-week monthly schedule, to allow me time to do that. And I ended up actually laying out 5 of the first 7 issues, because after issue 3, there was a 2-issue break, and then I laid out the 2-issue Wolverine crossover. Jim wasn't really originally supposed to be the person that did the finished art over that, because I was editing Alpha Flight and Jim had been on Alpha Flight for a year, and I was very happy having him on Alpha Flight. And he didn't really need anybody doing layouts for him at that point. One day I was talking to him on the phone about the latest Alpha Flight, and I mentioned to him that I was going to be doing this War Journal book where I was doing the layouts, and I was having trouble finding the right person to do the finished art. I was just a passing thing. I wasn't trying to see if he was interested. I didn't think there was any way he'd be interested, but he goes, "Oh, I'd be into that." And I, no fool I said, "Sure." I just had to find another artist for Alpha Flight. I was kind of robbing from myself on that one. But the sales on that book were just so astronomical that I was under a tremendous pressure to go monthly on it. Mm-hmm. And after I did that last Wolverine issue layout, it was just, I said, okay, I give up. Jim doesn't need me doing layouts from have him just do all the art, and I'll just concentrate on the writing, and we'll go monthly. So that's how that worked out.
At which point did you realize that Jim Lee was going to be as big as he was going to be, or did that just never occur to?
The year I had him on Alpha Flight, I could see every issue he was growing in leaps and bounds. His skill level was growing quite quickly. And I think on War Journal too, you can see like issue by issue, even over the ones that I was doing layouts on, his drawing and his rendering techniques improved pretty quickly. And after that, he just really took off. And it seemed to be, there was like this pattern at the time, like anytime I discovered and mentored a talent and they got popular on my books, they'd get heisted by the X-Men office, because all these guys grew up loving the X-Men, wanting to draw the X-Men. So I ended up, basically constantly feeding talent to the X-Men office, and then I'd have to go find another batch of new guys to mentor to come in.
Was that frustrating?
Only because I liked the fact that they, were going on and to doing something that high profile and having success doing it. My area of frustration on that was that the X-Men office didn't always coordinate their efforts with me. They kind of did stuff without asking me behind my back. And that I didn't care for. I would have preferred if they would have told me, hey, I really, like I would have done if I was pursuing an artist that was working for another editorial office. I would have gone to the editor and said, I really like this artist. I'm going to ask them if, they want to switch over to this book. I just wanted to let you know, be upfront with you. And if they do agree to it, we'll arrange it in a way where it's not going to screw up your schedules. And to work cooperatively that way. I thought, every editor had the right to try and hire whoever they wanted, but that you should do it in an upfront professional way. And that didn't always happen. And that part was frustrating.
When you had Jim Lee on Punisher War Journal, again, in terms of putting talent together, what do you think happened to his style and his career once he started being inked by Scott Williams?
It's interesting that Will Spartasio, Scott Williams, Jim Lee connection came together pretty early on, because Wills had been working for me for a little while. He started out primarily as an inker. My first day on the job, actually, as an editor, I was going through a stack of old submissions that had never been answered. People were sending in all these packets of submission art to try and get work. And the first day I discovered Art Adams. My first day on the job, I discovered Art Adams in this pile of submissions. And I showed that to my assistant editor at the time, Ann Nascente, who had been cooking up this bizarre character idea called Longshot.
Yeah.
And they ended up working on that. And then a little later that year, when we went to San Diego, Will showed up there and showed me his portfolio, and I really thought he had talent. But I thought his inking was farther along than his storytelling at that point. So I showed his work to Ann Nascente and to Louise Simonson, who was going to end up editing Longshot, and they all liked it. So Wills was the first of that group to come in through my office, and then when Jim Lee started, I knew they both lived in the same general area out west. So I put them in contact with each other and they became friends. And it turned out Wills turned me on to Scott. It turned out Scott and Wills had actually gone to high school together in Hawaii. And so they'd known each other from way back then. So they ended up like all kind of palling around together and coming in around the same time and supporting each other. But I just thought Scott's whole stylistic approach just fit Jim's work really well. Scott also had some aspirations to be a penciler. He did pencil at least one book for me. There was an issue of Strike Force Moratori he did the pencils on. So he's capable of being a penciler, but he just had such a career inking, particularly over Jim's work, that I think it was a little hard for him to find time to develop the penciling side. But I really wish he had like been able to carve out more time to do that. It'd been nice to see how he developed in that way as well.
Would you say The Punisher is what you're best known for?
To a lot of people, that's probably the case, which is a little unfortunate. I have very eclectic tastes, and I've worked on a variety of things. The first series I ever created that got published was The Last of the Dragons, which takes place in the 1870s, starts out in Japan and ends up in North America, in the Northwest America. And then even as an editor, at one time I was editing a very wide range of stuff. I was editing Rocket Raccoon, Solomon Kane, Doctor Strange, the Hulk, the Punisher, Power Pack,
Cloak and Dagger.
Cloak and Dagger, Gargoyle. And then there was an anthology book I edited for a while called Amazing High Adventure, which were adventure stories set in different historical periods. So I've always been very into a variety of genres and subject matter, and I liked bringing that to my editorial work as well. Did that answer your question? I kind of lost track of what your original question was.
No, I find it fascinating because of, you've listed a lot of titles. Like even back then, I think Doctor Strange and the Incredible Hulk, the Hulk was very popular, but it's in that Defender section of the Marvel universe, It's in the offbeat weird section. Is that something that you're generally attracted to? That
it just kind of ended up by accident that way. When Al Milgram left his editorial staff position to go full time as a freelancer writer artist, I basically was hired to replace him. So I inherited all of the titles he had been editing, except for Marvel Fanfare, which he kept editing as a freelance editor.
Yeah.
And then I also fortunately inherited his experienced assistant editor, who was Ann Nascente, because I'd never edited anything before. So I was kind of like half panicking and half excited about this position. But fortunately, Al stayed on an extra week to kind of help me learn things, and Ann was there too to really help me out. So I was fortunate in that regard. I wasn't totally thrown into the deep end of the pool without any support. So that eclectic line of books was largely what I inherited from Al. But after that, I was still adding things that were very eclectic, like the High Adventure book or the Solomon Kane book,
Mhm.
Rocket Raccoon. Uh, you know, People would walk into my office and they'd see the wall of covers of the different titles I'm working on. You see Rocket Raccoon next to the Punisher and all that, and they just they couldn't understand it because they walk into Mark Grimwald's office and you got Captain America, the Avengers, Iron Man. And you walk into Bob Harris's office, you got all the X-related titles and so on. And they walk into my office and there's no telling what you're going to find on the wall. But I like that.
Yeah, how did it feel like many years later seeing, Doctor Strange, Rocket Raccoon, the Hulk all in the same movie, the biggest movies of all time?
Yeah, yeah. It's like surreal. Marvel, when they do a new film comes out, except during this COVID period, but when a new film comes out, they generally have showings at one of the big movie theaters in New York City, and they invite basically everybody who works at Marvel or who used to work at Marvel to go to the premieres there. And it's stunning to see like these theaters just packed with people who worked in the business for years on the comics and loving them and knowing they had potential to expand into other media, but had been frustrated for so many years with so many false starts, like those really horrible early Captain America films, or that Fantastic Four film that never came out, that first one, or that Doctor Strange TV movie. And then, of course, there's the fabulous Howard the Duck film. But I remember when the Howard the Duck film came out, we thought, oh, at least we finally got a real producer on board. It was a George Lucas
Yeah.
production. So, we were kind of hoping it would be on something a little more high profile than Howard the Duck. But so they had a screening for the whole Marvel office, and we go into the theater. And when the movie was over and the lights came up, no one knew whether we were supposed to clap or not because we were just sitting there kind of stunned that, what was that? Um, uh, but these days, that's not a problem when we go to these current Marvel ones because some of them hit the ball out of the park farther than others. But I don't know if I've run into any of them that are actually downright dead. They're all usually very well crafted and put together and great casting. So they're a real joy to experience.
Speaking of Howard the Duck, he's also in that movie in Endgame.
Uh,
And so I want to ask you, and I want to ask you about the Punisher because I know that it's a hot button topic right now, especially a couple months ago. His symbol's kind of been used in less than savory
yeah.
endeavors. There was a whole conversation about whether or not Marvel should just retire the Punisher. As somebody who worked a lot on the Punisher, what do you think of this whole situation?
Uh, I have like a love-hate relationship with the character. I initially had no real interest in working on that character. Uh, I think the incarnation that came about that became popular was actually started years before by Archie Goodwin, because initially when the character was first created, he was kind of like, the guest villain of the month for a while in Spider-Man or whatever it was. And then Archie Goodwin wrote two stories in two different Marvel black and white magazine comics that kind of reshaped the characters to being a little more serious and realistic, so to speak. And I think those are what influenced Frank Miller's incarnation when he guest starred him in Daredevil.
Mm.
And I think those are what inspired Mary Jo Duffy, who used to work with Archie Goodwin at Epic. She proposed a graphic novel for me called Assassin's Guild, which was the first Punisher graphic novel that Jorge Savino did the art on. And around the same time, I was approached by Mike Zeck and Stephen Grant with their proposal for the original Punisher limited series. And I liked the proposal, and I really loved Mike Zeck's work I always had. So the idea of working with him was very appealing. And I was already working, I believe, with Joe Duffy at that point on her, Punisher graphic novel. So it seemed to make sense. And I think that they did pretty well, so that we ended up wanting to do more. And I was struggling with it because he's a character that isn't a hero in your normal sense at all. And at the same time, he's not like a villain who's out to take over the world. He thinks he's doing good. So my take, I evolved a little bit over time, but my take on the character, which I tried to put in everything I wrote and everything I edited to do with the character, was that he had this tremendous guilt for having survived and not protecting his family when the mob rubbed at his family, killed his family. He failed to protect his children and his wife. And so he had a death wish. And he became obsessed with going after violent criminals. On one level, it was to hopefully prevent those violent criminals from doing to other people what had happened to him. But also, I don't know how much of this was conscious or subconscious to him, but if he got killed or maimed in the process, he was getting what he deserved for failing to protect his family. So the book could have easily just been called The Punished, as it was The Punished. But he's, in that sense, he's like kind of a two-dimensional character. He's not like a real three-dimensional character. And ironically, it's easier to mess up a two-dimensional character than it is a three-dimensional character. So when he was used by other offices for guest starring in their books, when he got popular, all the other editorial offices wanted to guest star him. And they didn't always use the character the way I thought was along the lines I just laid out to you, where I wanted to make sure that even if he was successful in his missions, he was never satisfied. He never got a feeling of accomplishment. He was obsessed with either taking on more violent criminals and or finally being killed and paying the price he should pay. And so he didn't sit back and crack open a beer and say, yeah, it was a good job. He never had any downtime. He was just obsessed. It's on to the next one, on to the next one, on to the next one. And other people, kind of played fast and loose with that. And then at one point, when I was promoted to executive editor, I was no longer line editing any books. So I had to give up all of the books I was line editing to other line editors. And the only person that had room in their stable of titles to take that on was an editor that was already editing me on Punisher War Journal, but I didn't feel had a really good feel for the character. And even though there was some good work done in that editorial office on the character, there was a lot of stuff that I felt was way off base with the character. Some people established things like he did have downtime that he enjoyed, and one of the things he liked to do was go bear hunting. And he was a member of the NRA, and he built a torture chamber in his warehouse. It just stuff that's turned my hair white, that kind of stuff. So anyway, I just got so frustrated. I quit writing War Journal, and I just kind of divorced myself from anything to do with the character for a long time.
Yeah.
But I would occasionally, even when I was editing it though, and I was trying to maintain this character as being somebody who is tortured and destructive and self-destructive, and therefore not somebody who's really a hero and not somebody to be emulated. Every once in a while I'd get a letter from somebody that would say, I love the Punisher, I want to be just like him and all that. And I'm going, you don't get it. You don't get it.
Right.
So I'd have to stop what I was doing and write back and explain all this stuff to them. And it made me wonder though, like for every person that wrote in, like every few months I'd get one of these letters. I'm wondering how many people felt similarly but didn't bother to write. Um, and that troubled me. And that's one of the reasons why when control of the character went to that other editorial office after I got promoted, and these really wonky things started happening with the character, I felt that exacerbated the situation where people, they started like kind of glorifying things that I thought should have been lessons of things not to do. You know, to me, he was like a character showing what a horrible, lonely, unfulfilling life it is to be somebody like that, as opposed to, yeah, we need someone like this, you know. So, and then as you were mentioning earlier, now and in more recent times, you know, certain units in the military or the police have adopted the skull icon or variations on it. The last thing I want my police to be are vigilantes. And hopefully soldiers that have to deal often with death and all that. That's a, you know, that's a situation thankfully I've never had to deal with, but I'm thankful for those who have to do that, do it well, but I don't think that they should be glorifying in it, in that aspect of it. I don't think, you know, celebrating that you deal death is a positive thing. I think having to deal death when you need to protect yourself and your comrades or your country, that's something to be admirable. But I don't know that you should, you know, kind of glorify it in that way. So I really don't want to see my police running around with Punisher skulls on them.
What do you think the Marvel should be doing with the character now? Should they retire him, or would it not make a difference?
I wish they'd go back to the vision I was just outlining earlier, where he's sort of a warning lesson of what happens to people that go down this path. They're never happy. They never really, even if they accomplish a particular mission, more often than not, they're creating or perpetuating endless cycles of violence. They hardly ever solve any long-term thing. For all the criminals he's wiped out, are there less criminals now? You know, significantly less. Is there no more drug dealing, no more kidnapping, no more arms deals? No, they're still out there. You know, ideally, if someone really wanted to affect those things, they'd affect the long-term, the societal conditions that help foster those things to perpetuate. But that's hard to make an action comic out of. So it's, I think that there's a place for a character like that, but it needs to be very strongly editorially controlled and keep the vision. I now go back and look at some of the stuff I edited, and even though it falls into the area of categorized, I wish now I'd been even stricter in certain ways about how that's handled. But, you know, we could alter the character to fit things. We guest starred him in Power Pack, but, you know, we didn't have him doing, you know, some of the stuff he did in his own titles or when he guest starred in some other books.
He met Archie at one point. So,
oh yeah, thankfully I had nothing to do with that
one. We have 20 minutes left, so I want to skip ahead to my last question, and we have time. We can go back to a couple of the questions I had in between. I want to ask about the flying column and working with this was interesting. This is interesting to me. Can you tell us what this book is going to be about, and when can we expect it out, etc.?
Yeah, boy, that last one I wish I could answer. But this goes back to my family history. My grandfather on my mother's side was an Irish American from Alabama who joined the Navy, so he didn't have to go in the coal mines. And his ship got sent to the Philippines, and he fell in love with the Philippines. He was very unusual for a Southern white male in that he had no prejudices. He integrated into the Philippine society. He had tons of Filipino friends. He had Black friends, he had Asian friends. And while he was there, he went to dinner one night at a friend's house, and his friend was married to a Japanese woman. And as my grandfather walked up to knock on the door, there was a young Japanese woman in the window combing her hair, and he was smitten. That turned out to be my future grandmother. And so they eventually got married. And when they got married, she decided that she was going to be American from then on. And so she didn't teach any of their kids. She gave birth 11 times, raised 9 of them to adulthood in the Philippines in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when there were no vaccines or anything for, many of the diseases that are now we don't have to worry about. But she considered herself an American at that point, and she raised her kids to be Americans. She never taught them Japanese. The only Japanese thing that she couldn't get away from was the food. She was a great cook of Japanese food. But when the Japanese invaded during World War II, they took all Allied civilians and put them into prison camps. And the biggest one for civilians was on the University of Santo Tomas campus in the heart of Manila, Santo Tomas internment camp. And initially they took my grandfather and all his children and put them in there with the thousands of others. And they hated my grandmother for marrying the enemy. In fact, the first time they came to the house to collect my grandfather, a Japanese lieutenant, started roughing up my grandmother in front of her kids when he asked her who she thought was going to win the war. And she told him the Americans are going to win. But she did the best way possible. She felt she needed to be honest, but she did it with, traditional thing, her eyes down, not looking at him in the face. And when he started roughing her up in front of her kids, she knew the culture well enough to handle it. She said, "I'm just a lowly woman. My opinion won't affect anything. I'm not worthy of your anger." And that stopped him up short. And he goes, "You're right." And he stopped roughing her up. So she knew how to be honest and manipulate the culture to be as safe as possible. But eventually she worked her way up the chain of command and convinced the general in charge of Manila that she was an American by choice and she needed to be with her family. So he eventually relented. And as far as I know, she's the only Japanese civilian who was voluntarily imprisoned by the Japanese during the war, or at least in the Philippines. So they were in that prison camp in Santo Tomas for over 3 years, being progressively starved. And occasionally, the Kempeitai would come in and haul out people, and they would be killed at, in Intramuros somewhere, or made to dig their own graves and beheaded. And so when the Americans came back, MacArthur designated the 1st Cavalry Division and the 44th Tank Battalion a flying column, and he had them drive 100 miles from near Langayan down into Manila, told them not to stop for anything unless they really had to, and get into Manila and liberate Santo Tomas and Malacanang Palace. And they were supposed to make the legislative building too, but that was on the south side of the Pasig River, and the Japanese had blown all the bridges, so they couldn't get to that far. But they were obviously successful. Otherwise, I wouldn't exist, because my mother was an adolescent or an early teen at that point. So if they hadn't been successful, I wouldn't exist, because the Japanese are planning to kill as many civilians as they could, which they did kill a lot of people there. So when I was growing up, I spent some time actually my family lived with my grandmother. And to me, she was just grandma, She made fresh mochi for me once in a while. She was grandma. Yeah. And I had no idea what a tough broad she was and what she went through. She was under pressure the whole time she was in the camp to serve as an interpreter for the commandant, and she would always refuse. She would say she can't work for the enemy because she considered herself American. anyhow, every once in a while I'd hear snippets when the family would get together for holidays or summer visits, snippets of what they'd gone through, but it's just little bits they didn't want to talk about much. It was so traumatic. Uh, then eventually I sat the last four survivors down and taped them, grilled them mercilessly over a weekend about all the whole family history and everything I went through. And I ended up amassing this huge library of books about the Pacific War and the Philippines in particular, and a lot of memoirs, including ones that never got published. The authors gave me their copies of books that never got published um, about their experiences. And I wrote two screenplays, one that was based around the flying columns experiences of battling their way through to Manila and then to the prison camp and what happened there. And then one centered on my family's experiences. And then because I hadn't done enough work on spec yet, I combined them and added more and to create a miniseries script. And since my name isn't Spielberg or Hanks, the odds of that ever getting produced are pretty slim. But I also did graphic novel versions of those scripts. And the first one, The Flying Column, is due to be published by an imprint of the Naval Institute Press here in the US called Dead Reckoning is the name of the imprint. And I was going to do all the layouts and Bill Reinhold was going to do all the finished art. But I did a few layouts here and there, but we decided that I was going too slow, so Bill was going to do all the layouts as well. And then for some reason, Bill decided he was going to be moving very slowly. So the book should have been out already, that book. But he's still working on it. But what he's doing is just so friggin' gorgeous. He's doing it all in ink wash. And then we turn the ink wash into sepia tone. So it has that 1940s look to it. And it's just absolutely gorgeous work. But I wish I could tell you when he'd be done and when it would be coming out. But you know, every time we make plans or revise the plans, he takes longer at it. So it's very frustrating in that regard, but I gotta say that the work is just phenomenal. So I just hope it comes out in my lifetime. That's what I keep telling him.
Bill Reinhold is an incredible artist.
Yes, definitely.
And I think looking at his style, it's easy to see that he takes time.
Yeah,
but
and his drawing is just so beautiful. I don't think a lot of fans that aren't artists themselves appreciate some artists, like the subtlety he gets in some of the poses and the body language that the fans that are just into the action stuff don't realize that takes real drawing skill to pull off some of these subtle things.
It's hard. It's harder to draw, like, I guess, like the emotion of regret rather than the emotion of anger. But fans
or just get across either of those from just the body language in a figure that's this big.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's always the whole aspect of subtlety in terms of comic book art has always been fascinating to me, because it always seems like it's harder to do. And and that's also interesting to me because and I can't wait to read it, because I've driven by UST multiple times in my lifetime. My brother actually went to college there, but it's not a place where you drive by and you intellectualize that all of this horrible stuff happened there. You know, it's just a part of everyday life and everything. But that's a lot of Manila, actually.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Manila. Not the vast majority of Manila was practically a burned out wreck after the month-long battle to liberate it from the Japanese. A lot of that had to do with the Japanese purposely blowing up and torching buildings while they systematically tried to kill as many civilians as they could. Mm-hmm. But then there was also they put up such defense that the U.S. forces, even though they decided not to bomb from the air, they ended up bringing in these big artillery guns because the Japanese were inside these, major buildings like the the post office and the legislative building and all these that were made out of these huge giant masonry columns and all that. So they had no choice but to, try and blow big holes through that. And occasionally, in these war zones, the poor civilians get caught in the middle sometimes. And so a number of them died in the crossfire as well. So I've heard different estimates, but in theory, approximately 100,000 civilians died over the course of that month-long battle. A lot of them were purposely killed by the Japanese, but a lot of them were just unfortunately caught in the crossfire.
Have you seen? So you were here back in 2017, right, with Wills?
I think that was it. Yeah.
So did you go around the city to see the other war era sites?
We drove by a few areas, but I didn't have a lot of time. So most of my time was actually spent on the UST campus. I went there, and there's a plaque they have next to the front door that commemorates it being that internment camp. And I went there with Wills and a documentary filmmaker who's also a comics fan, Jay Ignacio, who knew some people there, and he helped arrange for us to go there. I didn't realize that they'd had this whole signing ceremony where we signed the guest visitors book and, the same book the Pope signed. They didn't have a sign on the same page, but, it was very flattering. But then they gave me a tour of the whole campus. I found what we think is the room on the third floor, right underneath the clock tower, where my grandfather and my two uncles looked out the window and saw the Sherman tanks break through the gate and come down toward them as they're being liberated. So that was, to stand in that spot was just like
surreal,
very emotional.
Yeah.
And then they took us to this really nice lunch on the campus where my mother's family had been progressively starved for over 3 years. I'm sitting there having this sumptuous lunch, and that was surreal too.
It's weird, right? It's weird. Yeah. Like there's one of the richest places here is called Bonifacio Global City. It's on a place called the Fort. It looks like something that's out of Southern California, but it's on a place called the Fort literally because it was built on a wartime fort. It's just really weird to see like how history changes and everything. We're down to our last few questions. So I mean, our last 5 minutes. So I just wanted to ask you. We were mentioning you had the X-Men. You had the future X-Men artists. You were always bringing them in. You got Jim and Wills and Art Adams. And I wanted to ask, as I know that the editorial staff, had their eyes on them, but how did the other artists feel, specifically the other artists that had been around for a while when you were bringing those guys in?
Well, at that point, the comics market was expanding, and Marvel was expanding too. So there was a need for new artists. So that was fortunate. But there were times when there were more established artists who were looking for work that I worked with as well. And I was trying to give them opportunities, particularly if they were drawing in a style that was no longer considered, cool by the current comics community, to see if they could leverage their strong visual storytelling skills into a somewhat different stylistic approach that might be more appealing to the current readership. So I had more success with that with some than others. But the trouble with that is that a lot of the stuff that proved to be popular with the comics crowd is sometimes the stuff that I don't think is the right stuff to be emulating. It got to be popular for a while to noodle up a lot of details on everything, have a million pouches that have all these little wrinkles and buttons and things on them. And that to me is like surface camouflage to cover up drawing weaknesses more than anything. And I prefer style that's based out of drawing knowledge as opposed to the things you use as camouflage to cover up drawing weaknesses. So, my 2 cents.
Especially as somebody who grew up loving Steve Ditko's art. There's all the minimal lines, you know, everything you
Yeah,
need is in there.
all with you know, so much knowledge behind them. It's almost like what do you call them, sumi e painters. You know, they do few lines, but each line has to have so much knowledge and information behind it. Or an artist like Alex Toth, where, you know, it looks like these simple lines, but there's so much drawing knowledge behind them. The less lines you use, it's becomes more important that there's more knowledge behind each line, because if, say, you're defining someone's jawline with a single line, that has to be perfect. Whereas if you're like, you know, doing a bunch of cross hatching and rendering and all that, the reader's eye can almost forgive you and fill in where that jawline actually is, as opposed to amongst all that cross hatching. But when you're doing it in a single line, it's got to be dead on. Otherwise, it just looks bad.
It'll look wrong. I feel like you worked on a lot of projects that were ahead of your time, especially, you know, the whole line at Epic. It feels like a precursor to a bunch of creator visions, you know, creator specific visions. Is there a particular book that you worked on that you were the most proud of, that doesn't really get that much fanfare?
Well, for the Epic line, it was ahead of its time. It was a creator-owned imprint at Marvel for the most part. They did do some company-owned stuff, but for the most part, it was creator-owned. And we were ahead of our time. I think part of the problem is that we weren't easy to brand because we had such diverse output. I published a book called Temporary Natives, which is the autobiography of a female Peace Corps volunteer in Africa in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I'm producing Alien Legion, which I created, and also, you know, the Clive Barker Hellraiser stuff, and Gru the Wanderer. Yeah. And, you know, it was just like all over the map. And I love that diversity, but the marketing people didn't know how to handle it. And the marketplace didn't know how to handle it. Whereas some of the graphic novel imprints now seem to be able to handle having much more diversity much better in the marketplace than we were back then. So I liked all those things. I thought there was a lot of work that was done that was just kind of missed by the major Marvel audience. We did like a graphic novel called Sinking that was sort of a biography of a based on a real person whose life kind of got all screwed up when they became schizophrenic. From the point of view of a friend that's observing this. Really powerful stuff, but you know, the X-Men readers weren't interested in that.
Yeah. So. You mentioned that a lot of comics fandom believes that they are comics fandom when they really only really like a particular section of comics. I find that fascinating. But speaking of that, to close this off, yeah, okay.
I just want to say that I think that that's an important point, is that my generation of people who grew up loving comics and becoming comics professionals, particularly editors, I think was the last generation where we knew we were not our audience. And therefore we were like more into it than our audience was. We were so into it that we fought to become professionals in this field, which was highly competitive to get into. Whereas most of the readership was, you know, they're into it, but they're not into it to that degree. And they don't have the encyclopedic knowledge that we built up over many years of things. And so also, if you want to appeal to a wider audience, you need to put out subject matter and put out books in a way that appeal to new readers, where if someone picks up a book and reads it, they're not going to be scratching and going, what the hell's going on here? And that's it. You want to be able to suck them into, whether it's the first issue or the 15th or the 37th issue or the 110th issue, suck them into the series. And like the first Spider-Man I read was like, you know, in the 18, 19 or 20 issue. And I didn't know the origin, but I knew enough information that was built into the flow of the story that I knew his long and short-term status quo, it was built into the flow of the story, that I was able to grab on and go for that ride along with everybody else and get hooked by it. Nowadays, that skill, that craft seems to be lost, and they'll just take what should be a beautiful art splash page and cover it with text to explain everything that's gone before. To me, like, so that's a very not very well-crafted approach to doing that. But
Yeah.
again, that's me on my soapbox about what's wrong with comics today, kind of thing.
So would you say, so last two questions,
Sure.
this can go really quickly. Jim Shooter, reputation deserved or bad rap?
Jim did some incredibly good things, and he could be a very good guy. He could also be the exact opposite. He's one of the more complicated personalities I encountered. He had the good sense to hire me, but he also almost caused me to quit or fire me on numerous occasions because he did stuff that I thought was horrendous. So he's a real mixed bag. It's really hard you can't categorize him on one. I can name you all the great stuff he did and all the stuff that he did that was just needlessly horrible. And so he's definitely a mixed bag.
And I'm asking this last question mainly for my nephew and for my niece. What was it like working with Steve Purcell?
Steve, Steve actually was part of this crew of friends from the East Bay area in San Francisco that included Mike Mignola and Art Adams and Steve. And I think at one point they actually had an apartment together. But they all pretty much came in through my office. And Steve sent me some samples, and they were enough for me to hire him to do a story for me in Amazing High Adventure. And then I think he worked on Sectars or some other thing. But then I saw some other publisher came out with the first Sam and Max thing. And it's very rare I'll laugh out loud when I'm reading a comic, but Sam and Max makes me laugh out loud. And so I talked to Steve about it, and we eventually did a new Sam and Max at Epic, and we collected all the old stuff and colored it for a trade paperback. And I just love Sam and Max. That's one of my favorite comics of all time. But Steve Purcell is like a great guy. He's a great professional, and he's hilarious. So what more could you ask for?
Yep.
I've got, I can't see it now because I got this up, but I've got the Sam and Max action figures that came out recently. I've got the Max plush toy sitting up on my bookshelf over here.
Yep, we're a family that loves Sam and Max. There's a part in that first set of comics where they go to the Philippines and then he just draws whatever, and then Sam goes, well, here we are in the Philippines, drawn with obviously no research. We just start laughing. It's so good.
I don't know if it's going to come to pass or not, but in theory, I'm working on writing a script for a joint Canadian-Philippine action film production. So I've been trying to do some more research into Philippine myths and legends. There's some friggin' bizarre myths and legends from the Philippines. But I'm only gonna have a little bit of snippet of that, I think, in this. But if it moves forward, I'll let you know. I don't know if it'll ever get in front of the cameras, but I'm having fun researching it and coming up with story ideas. It'll involve a lot of Philippine martial arts, though.
We'll take Western myths and we'll make them worse.
What's that one where like the body is torn in half at the entrails hanging on and it floats around? Oh my God.
It's called the Manananggal, which literally means a remover. Somebody who removes. So it's basically a vampire, except at sunset, the torso splits up from the legs. The legs get left behind somewhere, and then it goes looking for a fetus. So, read it to that societal expectation, what you will. It was looking for a fetus to abort, basically.
Yeah. Man, how did these things evolve? Like, who's the first person that came up with the germ of this? That Oh my goodness.
And then if you manage to find the legs and pour salt in it, then they can no longer reattach, and then they will die come sunrise.
Now, if you're up in the mountains near Baguio or something, salt's going to be hard to come by as opposed to if you live on the coast. So you're screwed unless you live along the coast.
Basically.
Yeah. Baguio is one of the places I really want to go to too. I didn't make it there. My mother, when she was growing up, the family, when Christmas came, they drive up there to chop down their Christmas trees.
Yeah.
That was the only place pine trees grew up there.
Yeah, that's my
But
dad.
someday I'm going to get back there and spend more time.
My dad is from Baguio, so that's basically what we used to do when we were kids before they outlawed the cutting down of pine trees.
Okay.
Now we just have fake Christmas trees, which is okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Carl Potts. This is a great interview.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And